My name is Leslie. I'm 57 years old, and I spent 30 years building a life on 300 acres of Tennessee farmland. My wife passed when our daughter was just 8, and I raised her alone on that land. The farm was everything I had, everything I promised my late wife I'd protect. The day of my daughter's wedding was supposed to be the happiest moment of my life. Instead, my son-in-law turned it into a nightmare I'll never forget. Before I tell you what happened that day, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Hit that like button if you've ever had to stand up for what's yours, and subscribe. Because what happened next changed everything. I thought I knew about family. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this ends. I suppose I should start at the beginning, back when things made sense. Greenfield Farm sits on 300 acres of rolling Tennessee hills, with a creek running through the eastern pasture and an old timber barn my grandfather built with his own hands back in 1952. He bought the land after coming home from the war, spent every dollar he had, and then some. My father inherited it, worked it his whole life, and when he passed, it came to me. The land isn't much to look at if you don't know what you're seeing. No fancy equipment, no massive operations, just apple orchards on the south slope, a small herd of cattle, some chickens, and a vegetable garden my wife Sarah used to tend. We never got rich off it, but we never went hungry either. Every inch of that soil I know by heart. I can tell you which trees produce the sweetest apples, where the ground gets muddy after rain, which fence posts need replacing every few years. I met Sarah when I was 25 years old at a county fair. She was wearing a yellow sundress and laughing at something her friend said, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. Took me 3 tries to work up the courage to ask her to dance. She said yes, thank God. And we were married 8 months later. Sarah loved the farm as much as I did. She'd wake up before dawn to help with the morning chores, spent her afternoons in the garden, her hands deep in the earth. We had a simple life, but it was a good one. When Amanda came along, everything felt complete. Our daughter had Sarah's smile and my stubborn streak. She was smart as a whip, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. She'd follow me around the farm when she was little, her tiny boots splashing through puddles trying to help feed the chickens. Sarah and I would sit on the porch after Amanda went to bed, watching the fireflies and planning our future. We thought we had all the time in the world. But Sarah got sick when Amanda was only 8 years old. Cancer. It happened so fast I still can't quite believe it. One day she was complaining about being tired, and 6 months later she was gone. I remember standing at her grave holding Amanda's hand, wondering how I was supposed to do this alone. My little girl looked up at me with those big eyes and asked when Mommy was coming home. I didn't have an answer that made sense to either of us. I made a promise that day, standing in that cemetery with my daughter's hand in mine. I promised Sarah I'd keep the farm for Amanda, that I'd make sure she always had a home to come back to. I promised I'd raise our daughter, teach her the values we believed in. For 20 years, I kept those promises. I worked the farm alone. Got up every morning, no matter how tired I was, made sure Amanda had everything she needed. Amanda grew up strong and independent. She helped me on the farm all through high school, never complained about the early mornings or the hard work. She got good grades, earned herself a scholarship to college. I was so proud the day she left for school, even though the farmhouse felt empty without her. She studied marketing, graduated near the top of her class, got herself a good job in the city. I missed her terribly, but I was glad she was building a life for herself. She'd come home to visit when she could, usually on holidays. We'd sit on that same porch where I used to sit with Sarah, and Amanda would tell me about her work, her friends, her life in the city. The farm seemed too quiet, too small for her now, but she was always kind about it. Never made me feel like I was holding her back. Our relationship was good. strong. Or so I thought. When Amanda called to tell me she'd met someone, I was happy for her. She deserved to find love, build a family of her own. His name was Brandon, she said. 33 years old, worked in real estate development. She sounded excited, happier than I'd heard her in years. A few weeks later, she brought him down to meet me. Brandon showed up in a silver luxury sedan, wearing an expensive suit and designer sunglasses. He shook my hand firmly, called me sir, complimented the property. He seemed polite enough, confident in that way. Successful young men often are. He asked good questions about the farm, seemed genuinely interested in how we managed the orchards and the cattle rotation. I wanted to like him. Amanda was glowing, hanging on his every word, and that was enough for me. We walked the property that afternoon, the three of us. Brandon kept pointing out features of the land, talking about the potential, the possibilities. At the time, I thought he was just being enthusiastic, trying to connect with me. Amanda squeezed my arm and whispered that she was glad we were getting along. After they left that evening, I sat on the porch feeling good about things. My daughter had found someone who seemed decent and stable. What more could a father ask for? They got engaged 6 months later. Amanda called me with the news, her voice shaking with excitement. They were planning a wedding for the following spring. I told her I was happy for her, that I'd do whatever I could to help. Inside, I felt that bittersweet ache every parent feels when their child takes that step into their own life. Sarah should have been there to help plan the wedding, to share in this moment, but I'd do my best to be there for both of them. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun sink below the hills, I felt at peace. The farm was quiet, just the sound of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. I thought about Sarah, wondered what she'd think of Brandon, hoped she'd approve. I thought I had done everything right, raised our daughter to be smart and careful. I thought the hard part was behind me. I had no idea what was coming. The first sign of trouble came about 6 weeks before the wedding. Brandon drove down to the farm one Saturday afternoon. Said he wanted to spend some time with me. Man to man, Amanda was busy with wedding planning, he explained, and he thought it'd be good for us to get to know each other better. I appreciated the gesture, invited him in for coffee. We walked the property after lunch, just the two of us. The weather was perfect, warm spring sunshine and a light breeze. Brandon seemed relaxed, asking questions about the farm's history, my plans for the future. Then his questions started to shift. He asked about the property value, what the land might be worth on the open market. I gave him a rough estimate, figured he was just curious. Then he asked about my retirement plans. Did I intend to keep working the farm indefinitely? Had I thought about what I'd do if I couldn't manage it anymore? I told him. I planned to keep going as long as I was able, that the farm was my life. He nodded thoughtfully, then suggested that I deserved to rest, that I'd worked hard enough. Maybe it was time to think about enjoying life, he said, instead of breaking my back every day. I felt uncomfortable, but tried to brush it off. Changed the subject to the wedding, asked about the honeymoon plans. Brandon followed my lead, but something in the air had shifted. The easy friendliness from earlier had been replaced by something else, something I couldn't quite name. When he left that afternoon, I stood in my driveway watching his car disappear down the road, feeling uneasy. 4 weeks before the wedding, Amanda and Brandon invited me to dinner at their apartment in the city. I drove up on a Friday evening, brought a bottle of wine and some fresh vegetables from the garden. The apartment was nice, modern, all clean lines, and expensive furniture. Not my style, but I could see Amanda was proud of it. Dinner started pleasantly enough. We ate pasta and salad, talked about the wedding preparations, laughed about family members who were already causing drama about seating arrangements. Then, over dessert, Brandon's demeanor changed. He set down his fork, folded his hands, and looked at me seriously. He started talking about family assets, about the importance of consolidating resources. He used a lot of business terms I didn't fully understand, talked about trusts and estate planning and financial security. Then he got to the point. He thought it would be wise for me to sign some papers, he said, to protect Amanda's future, to make sure everything was handled properly if something happened to me. I asked him to explain exactly what he meant. Brandon's answer was vague, full of more business jargon. Amanda sat quietly, not meeting my eyes, pushing her dessert around on her plate. I asked to see the actual documents he was talking about. He said his lawyer was still drawing them up, but we could discuss the general concept. I felt my jaw tighten. I looked at Amanda, but she was staring at her plate. I turned back to Brandon and said as politely as I could manage that the farm would stay with me until I was gone, that it would go to Amanda when the time came, but that time wasn't now. I wasn't signing anything without understanding exactly what it meant and talking to my own lawyer first. Brandon's face changed. The friendly mask slipped for just a second, and I saw something cold underneath. But he recovered quickly, smiled, said he understood that we could discuss it another time. The rest of the evening was tense. I left earlier than planned, claiming I had to get back for early morning chores. On the drive home, my mind was racing. Something wasn't right. Brandon's interest in the farm had gone from curiosity to something else entirely. And Amanda, why hadn't she said anything? Why had she sat there silent while Brandon pressured me? A few days later, I called Amanda, tried to talk to her about what Brandon had said about the papers he wanted me to sign. She brushed it off, said it was just financial planning, that Brandon was trying to be helpful. He just wanted to make sure I was taken care of, she said, that everything would be organized and proper. But her voice sounded wrong, flat, rehearsed. This wasn't my daughter talking, or if it was, she wasn't being honest with me. I asked her directly if she and Brandon had discussed the farm, if they had plans for it. She hesitated too long before answering. When she finally spoke, she said, "Brandon just wanted to help, that I was being paranoid." Then she said she had to go, hung up before I could press further. I sat in my kitchen that night, staring at the phone. My daughter felt like a stranger. The easy warmth we'd always shared had been replaced by distance and evasion. For the first time in my life, I didn't trust what Amanda was telling me. The next morning, I called my old friend, Harold. We'd known each other since high school, played football together, stood up at each other's weddings. Harold had gone to law school, became a small-town attorney, handling wills and property disputes. He was someone I trusted completely. I drove to his office and laid out the whole situation. Harold listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as I talked. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. He'd seen this before, he said. Someone marrying into a family, pressuring the older generation to sign over assets. It rarely ended well. Harold advised me to protect myself legally. He suggested setting up a living trust, putting the farm into it with specific terms. That way, Amanda would still inherit everything when I passed, but nobody could touch it while I was alive. Brandon wouldn't be able to claim any of it, couldn't sell it, or mortgage. It couldn't do anything without my explicit consent. I spent the next week thinking about it. Part of me felt guilty, like I was being suspicious of my own daughter. But the other part, the part that had kept me and my family safe all these years, knew something was wrong. I went back to Harold's office and signed the papers. The farm went into the trust. Amanda was the sole beneficiary upon my death. But until then, it was completely protected. I didn't tell Amanda or Brandon what I'd done. I told myself I was just being cautious, that it was probably unnecessary. But I also started paying closer attention, started noticing things I'd missed before. One evening I was scrolling through my computer, couldn't sleep. I looked up Brandon's real estate company on a whim. What I found made my stomach drop. The company had filed for bankruptcy 8 months earlier. There were legal filings, creditor claims, angry reviews from investors who'd lost money. This wasn't just a failed business. It was a disaster. I dug deeper, found more concerning information. Brandon had debts, serious ones. I couldn't sleep that night, couldn't stop thinking about what it meant. My daughter was about to marry a man who was financially desperate, a man who'd been pressuring me to sign over my property. I should have told Amanda, should have sat her down and shown her what I'd found. But I was afraid of pushing her away, afraid of ruining her wedding, afraid she wouldn't believe me. So I kept quiet and told myself I was protected. The trust was in place. Whatever Brandon was planning, he couldn't touch the farm. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, asking myself if I should say something. The answer kept coming back. No. If I was wrong, I'd destroy my relationship with my daughter for nothing. If I was right, she probably already knew and had chosen Brandon anyway. Either way, confronting her now would only cause pain. Should I have listened to that voice in my head, telling me to speak up? Probably, but I didn't, and that decision would cost me more than I could have imagined. The morning of the wedding arrived with clear blue skies and warm sunshine. I woke at 5 a.m, having barely slept at all. I stood at my bedroom window looking out over the farm in the early light. The land stretched out before me, peaceful and familiar. I thought about Sarah, wished desperately that she was there with me. She would have known what to do, what to say. I put on my gray suit, the one I'd bought special for the occasion, stood in front of the mirror, and barely recognized myself. When had I gotten so old? The lines around my eyes seemed deeper, my hair more gray than I remembered. I looked like a man carrying heavy weight, which I suppose I was. I kept telling myself that today was about Amanda's happiness. Whatever doubts I had, whatever concerns, I'd keep them to myself. This was her day. I'd smile and dance and give a toast and be the proud father everyone expected me to be. Tomorrow, I could worry. Today, I just had to get through. The wedding was being held at a large hotel and conference center about an hour from the farm. I drove slowly in no rush to arrive. The parking lot was already filling up when I got there. 200 guests, Amanda had said. I'd known maybe 20 of them. The rest were Brandon's family, his business associates, Amanda's friends from the city. I was going to be surrounded by strangers. I made my way inside, following signs to the bridal preparation rooms. Found Amanda's room and knocked softly. One of her bridesmaids opened the door, squealed something about how I couldn't see the bride before the ceremony. I explained I just wanted a moment with my daughter. The bridesmaid hesitated, then let me in. Amanda stood in front of a full-length mirror, wearing her wedding dress. She looked beautiful. The dress was simple and elegant. Her hair was swept up, and for a moment she looked exactly like Sarah had on our wedding day. My throat tightened. I walked over and put my hands on her shoulders. She smiled at me in the mirror, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was tension in her shoulders, something brittle in her expression. I asked if she was happy, really happy. She turned to face me and said, "Of course she was." Why would I ask that? But her voice was too bright, too defensive. I wanted to tell her everything. About the trust, about what I'd found online, about my concerns with Brandon. I wanted to beg her to reconsider, to at least wait, to give herself more time. But looking at her in that dress, surrounded by her friends, I couldn't do it. What if I was wrong? What if I ruined this day for her, based on nothing but suspicion? So instead, I hugged her, told her I loved her, that I just wanted her to be happy. She hugged me back, but it felt stiff, performative. When we pulled apart, she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. I left the room feeling worse than when I'd entered. The ceremony was held outdoors in the hotel's garden. White chairs lined up in neat rows, an archway covered in flowers at the front. The weather was perfect. Everything looked beautiful. I took my place at the end of the aisle, waiting to walk my daughter to her new life. When the music started and Amanda appeared beside me, I felt my eyes fill with tears. I linked my arm through hers, and we began the slow walk down the aisle. 200 faces turned to watch us. I kept my eyes forward, focused on Brandon standing at the altar in his tuxedo, smiling confidently. When we reached the front, the officiant asked who gave this woman in marriage. I said I did, my voice thick. I placed Amanda's hand in Brandon's, looked my future son-in-law in the eye. For just a second I saw something there. Triumph, maybe. Satisfaction. Then it was gone, replaced by the appropriate solemn expression. I took my seat in the front row alone. The ceremony proceeded. Vows were exchanged, rings were placed. The officiant pronounced them married. Everyone clapped. I clapped too automatic, while my gut twisted with unease. The reception was in the hotel's grand ballroom. 200 guests filed in, found their assigned tables. Music played, champagne flowed. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter. I sat at the family table picking at my food, making small talk with relatives I barely knew. Amanda and Brandon made their rounds greeting guests, posing for photos. They looked like the perfect couple. Maybe they were. Maybe I was just a cynical old man who couldn't let go. Brandon drank champagne steadily throughout the dinner. I watched him knock back glass after glass, watched his face get flushed, watched him get louder and more animated. Amanda stayed close to him, her hand on his arm, smiling that too bright smile. I was starting to relax slightly, thinking maybe the day would end without incident, when Brandon stood up. He tapped his champagne glass with a knife, calling for everyone's attention. The room gradually quieted. Brandon cleared his throat, smiled at the crowd, and began to speak. He thanked everyone for coming, made a few jokes that got polite laughs. Then he started talking about family, about unity, about building a future together. His words were slightly slurred, his gestures too big. He talked about combining resources, about the strength that came from bringing families together. Then he gestured to me, asked me to come up and join him at the front of the room. My heart started pounding. I didn't want to go up there, but 200 people were watching. I stood and walked to where Brandon stood, forcing a smile. He put his arm around my shoulders, heavy and possessive. Brandon continued his speech, talking now about the farm, about heritage, about passing down legacies. He called it a treasured family asset, said I'd worked too hard for too long. The crowd nodded along, thinking this was a touching tribute. I stood there rigid, knowing something bad was coming. Then Brandon turned to face me directly. His smile was wide, but his eyes were cold. He said it was time for me to rest, time for the younger generation to take over. And, as a wedding gift, as a show of family unity, he thought I should hand over the keys to Greenfield Farm. Right now, in front of everyone. The room went quiet. I stood there frozen, not quite believing what I'd heard. Brandon kept smiling, waiting. The silence stretched out. People started to look uncomfortable, confused. This wasn't a normal wedding speech. I found my voice, kept it low, tried to keep this private despite the audience. I said this wasn't the time or place for this conversation. Brandon's smile didn't waver. He said, "Come on, don't be difficult. This is about family." His hand on my shoulder tightened. He was performing for the crowd, painting me as the stubborn old man who wouldn't let go. I pulled away from his grip, faced him directly. Said clearly, firmly that no, the farm was not a wedding gift. It would stay with me. Brandon's face flushed darker. He raised his voice, called me a stubborn old man. Said the farm should be Amanda's, that I was being selfish. The crowd was murmuring now, uncomfortable. I tried to de-escalate. Suggested we talk about this privately later. Brandon wasn't having it. He was drunk and angry and losing control of his performance. He shouted that I'd hand over those keys right now. I turned to walk away, done with this spectacle. Brandon grabbed my shoulder, spun me around. I told him to take his hands off me. The room was silent now, everyone watching this train wreck unfold. Brandon's face was twisted with rage. His hand came up fast, and I didn't have time to react. The slap connected with my cheek with a crack that echoed through the room. The force of it knocked me sideways. I stumbled, lost my balance, fell into the table behind me. Plates crashed, glasses shattered, food scattered across the white tablecloth. Someone screamed. The whole room erupted into chaos. People jumped up from their seats shouting. I lay there for a moment, stunned. My face burned where he'd hit me. My ears were ringing. I could taste blood where I'd bitten my tongue. Slowly, I pushed myself up to sitting, then to standing. Hands reached out to help me, but I waved them away. I looked across the room and found Amanda. She was standing frozen, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. But she didn't come to me, didn't move to help me, just stood there, crying. And in that moment, I knew. She'd known this was coming. Maybe not the violence, but the demand for the farm. She'd been part of this plan all along. I looked at Brandon. He was breathing hard, still angry, but starting to realize what he'd done. The crowd had gone quiet again, stunned. I felt eyes on me from every direction, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. I could have shouted, could have cursed him out, could have hit him back, could have made an even bigger scene. But I was raised better than that. I straightened my jacket, touched my face gently. My cheek was already swelling. I looked at Amanda one more time, hoping she'd say something, do something. She just stood there, crying silently. I turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for me. No one spoke. The only sound was my footsteps on the marble floor and Amanda's quiet sobbing. When I reached the door, I stopped. Turned back to look at Brandon one last time. He was watching me. His expression caught between anger and fear. I said loud enough for the room to hear that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Then I walked out into the cool evening air, leaving my daughter's wedding behind. I made it to my truck in the parking lot before my hands started shaking. Sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe steady. My face throbbed. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw my cheek was already swelling, turning red and purple. By tomorrow, I'd have a hell of a bruise. I could still hear the music from the reception muffled by distance and walls. Life going on without me. My daughter's wedding continuing as if nothing had happened. Maybe that's what they wanted. Maybe they'd spin this, make me the villain, the crazy old man who caused a scene. But I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't going to let this stand. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands. Time to make the calls I'd been preparing for. I dialed Harold first. He answered on the second ring. I could hear concern in his voice as he said my name. I told him what happened, kept my voice steady, even though my hands were still shaking. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, Harold said he'd been waiting for my call, that everything was ready. 2 weeks earlier, after signing the trust documents, I'd gone back to Harold's office, asked him to prepare for the worst-case scenario. What if Brandon tried to force the issue? What if things turned ugly? Harold had helped me set everything up, made sure every legal protection was in place. The farm was locked down tight. Brandon couldn't touch a single acre of it no matter what happened. Harold had prepared all the paperwork, filed everything properly. The trust was ironclad. Amanda was still the sole beneficiary when I died. That hadn't changed. But while I was alive, Brandon had no claim whatsoever. He couldn't sell it, couldn't mortgage, it couldn't force me out. It was protected completely. Harold asked if I was okay. I said I would be. He said he'd have copies of all the relevant documents delivered to Brandon's lawyer first thing Monday morning. Let him see exactly what he couldn't have. I thanked Harold and hung up, but I had one more call to make. I scrolled through my contacts and found the name Marcus. I'd hired him 3 weeks ago. Marcus was a private investigator, worked out of Nashville. When my concerns about Brandon had grown too strong to ignore, I'd hired Marcus to dig into his background. Marcus had been thorough. Now I needed to know what he'd found. Marcus answered immediately, like he'd been expecting my call. He said he had everything I needed. Brandon didn't just owe money. He owed $800,000. His real estate company hadn't just failed, it had imploded spectacularly. Brandon had made bad investments, over-leveraged himself, borrowed from the wrong people. He was drowning in debt and getting desperate. But that wasn't the worst part. Marcus had found emails and text messages. He had access to Brandon's and Amanda's phones legally obtained through means I didn't ask about. The messages showed they'd been planning this for months. Discussed how to get the farm from me, talked about selling the land to developers, planned how to split the money. Amanda had been in on it from the start. She'd known about Brandon's debts before they got engaged. She'd helped plan the strategy. In one message, Brandon worried I wouldn't give in. Amanda had replied not to worry, that I always caved eventually when it came to her, that I'd do anything to make her happy. Reading those words hurt worse than the slap. I'd spent 20 years raising her alone, working myself to exhaustion to give her opportunities, keeping the farm safe, like I'd promised Sarah. And she'd been planning to take it from me this whole time. Marcus asked if I wanted him to send the files. I said yes. Within seconds, my phone buzzed with incoming messages. Screenshots of texts, forwarded emails, call logs. Everything documented and time-stamped. Proof of exactly what they'd planned. I sat in my truck reading through the messages in the dim light from my phone screen. There were dozens of them. Casual discussions about my farm like it was already theirs. Brandon talking about how much they could get for the property. Amanda suggesting ways to pressure me. Both of them laughing about how I'd be glad to retire once they convinced me. One message from Amanda stood out. Brandon had asked what they'd do if I refused. Amanda had written back that they'd find another way, that the farm was rightfully hers anyway, since Mom died. That I was just being stubborn and selfish, holding on to it. I closed my eyes, leaned my head back against the seat. My daughter really believed that, believed she deserved the farm because Sarah had died, as if that gave her some claim. Never mind that I'd worked that land for 30 years, that I'd kept it going through droughts and recessions, and the loneliness of raising a child alone. Never mind the promises I'd made, the sacrifices I'd given. To her, I was just an obstacle between her and what she wanted. I looked back at the hotel, could see the lit windows of the ballroom, shadows of people moving inside. They were probably trying to salvage the reception, pretending nothing had happened. Or maybe they were talking about me, about what a scene I'd caused. Either way, they'd gotten the message I was gone. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I started the truck, but instead of driving away, I sat there with the engine running. Part of me wanted to just go home, hide on my farm, lick my wounds in private. That would be easier. But another part of me, the part that had built a life from nothing and protected it for decades, wasn't ready to slink away. They wanted the farm fine. Let them see exactly what they couldn't have. Let them understand who they'd decided to cross. I put the truck in gear, but instead of heading toward the highway, I drove back around to the hotel entrance, parked right in front, got out, and walked back inside. Time to end this. I walked back through the hotel doors with my head high, despite the throbbing in my face. The lobby was quiet, just a bored-looking desk clerk who glanced at me and then looked away. I could hear the reception still going music and voices carrying down the hallway. I followed the sound back to the ballroom. When I pushed open the doors, the room went silent instantly. 200 people turned to stare at me. The music cut off mid-song. Brandon was on the dance floor with Amanda, and they both froze when they saw me. Brandon's face went pale. Amanda looked terrified. I walked straight down the center aisle between the tables. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was my footsteps on the polished floor. I walked up to the small stage where the band had been playing and gestured to the lead singer. He looked at Brandon, unsure what to do. I held out my hand for the microphone. After a moment, he handed it to me. I turned to face the crowd. 200 wedding guests, all dressed up, all staring at me, with various expressions of shock and discomfort. Some looked sympathetic. Most just looked confused. Brandon started toward me, but 2 of the groomsmen grabbed his arms, held him back. I spoke into the microphone, my voice calm and steady. I apologized for the disruption. Said I thought everyone deserved to know the truth about what had just happened, about why a groom had assaulted his new father-in-law in front of all these witnesses. I told them about Brandon's requests for the farm, about the pressure, the manipulative conversations, the attempt tonight to publicly coerce me into handing over my property. I told them about the slap, though they had all seen that. Then I told them what they didn't know. I explained that 3 weeks ago, I'd placed Greenfield Farm into a living trust. My daughter Amanda was the sole beneficiary upon my death. But while I was alive, the farm was completely protected. Brandon couldn't touch it, couldn't sell it, couldn't borrow against it, couldn't force me to sign it over. It was locked down legally permanently until the day I died. The crowd murmured. Some people pulled out their phones, probably looking up what a living trust meant. Brandon had gone from pale to red, his fists clenched at his sides. I wasn't done. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the hotel's projection system. They'd used it earlier for the wedding slideshow. Now, I used it for something else. I pulled up the emails and text messages Marcus had sent me and projected them onto the screen behind me. Huge, 15 feet tall, impossible to miss. The messages between Brandon and Amanda appeared on screen. Their discussions about the farm, about selling it, about the money they'd make. Amanda's suggestions for how to pressure me. Brandon's worries about his debts. All of it right there for everyone to see. Amanda made a sound like a wounded animal. She tried to move toward the stage, but someone held her back. I scrolled through more messages, let the crowd read them. Let them see the casual cruelty, the calculating manipulation, the complete betrayal of trust. Then I brought up the financial documents Marcus had found. Brandon's bankruptcy filing, his outstanding debts, $800,000 owed to various creditors and investors, court judgments against him, the full scope of his financial disaster displayed for everyone to witness. I turned to look at Brandon. He was shaking, his face purple with rage and humiliation. I spoke directly to him through the microphone, said that the farm was protected, that he'd never get his hands on a single acre, that everything he'd planned had failed. Then I looked at Amanda. My daughter was sobbing, her perfect wedding makeup streaked down her face. Part of me wanted to comfort her, wanted to take it all back, wanted to pretend none of this had happened. But I couldn't. She'd made her choice. She'd chosen Brandon and his schemes over her own father, over the memory of her mother, over everything we'd built together. I told her I knew she'd been part of it from the beginning, that I'd read their messages, seen their plans, that she'd betrayed me as much as he had, maybe more because I'd expected better from her. Brandon lost control completely then. He screamed that I couldn't do this, that the farm was his, that he needed that money. He tried to rush the stage, but the groomsmen were holding him back. He was hysterical, crying and shouting, all pretense of dignity gone. He yelled about his debts, about the people he owed, about how he was supposed to pay them back. Admitted everything in front of 200 witnesses. Security was coming now. I could see them entering the ballroom, moving toward Brandon. But I was done anyway. I disconnected my phone, handed the microphone back to the stunned band leader, and stepped off the stage. As I walked toward the exit for the second time that night, I passed Amanda. She reached out to me, tried to grab my arm, said, "Please, Daddy, please." I stopped and looked at her. This woman in a wedding dress, who looked like my daughter, but had the heart of a stranger. I told her I hoped Brandon was worth it, that she'd thrown away her family for a con man and a fantasy. Then I kept walking. Some people in the crowd were clapping. Others were taking pictures and videos on their phones. This wedding was going to be talked about for years. I passed Brandon being restrained by security, still screaming about the farm, about the money, completely unhinged. I didn't look at him. I walked out into the parking lot, got in my truck, and drove away. This time, I didn't look back. The hotel disappeared in my rearview mirror. I pointed my truck toward home, toward the farm, toward the only thing that had never betrayed me. The drive home took an hour. I spent it in silence, my mind oddly blank. When I pulled up to the farmhouse, it was nearly midnight. The porch light was on like always. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it that morning a lifetime ago. I got out of the truck and stood in my driveway looking at my land in the moonlight. The farm was still mine, still safe. I'd protected it, protected what Sarah and I had built, protected the promise I'd made. But the cost felt almost too high to bear. I walked inside, locked the door behind me, and for the first time in 20 years, I let myself cry. The first week after the wedding was the hardest. I didn't sleep well, couldn't eat much. Kept replaying that night in my head, seeing Amanda's face, hearing Brandon's screams, feeling the sting of that slap. My cheek healed slowly, the bruise fading from purple to yellow to green before finally disappearing. But the other wounds stayed fresh. I threw myself into work. Got up before dawn. Every day worked until I was too exhausted to think. Repaired fences that didn't really need repairs. Cleaned out the barn until it was spotless. Pruned the apple trees, even though it was the wrong season for it. My body ached constantly, but that was good. Physical pain was easier to handle than the emotional kind. The story spread through town fast. Small communities are like that. Everyone had heard about the wedding, about what happened. Some people I'd known for decades crossed the street to avoid me, uncomfortable with the drama. Others went out of their way to stop and talk, offering support or sympathy. I appreciated the latter, but mostly wanted to be left alone. Harold called regularly to update me on the legal situation. Brandon's lawyer had received the trust documents and immediately advised his client that there was no legal path forward. The farm was untouchable. Brandon had threatened to sue anyway, but his lawyer apparently talked him out of it. There was no case. I'd done everything properly, protected my assets legally. Brandon had no standing. Amanda tried to contact me numerous times those first few weeks. Phone calls that I didn't answer. Text messages that I deleted without reading. A letter that arrived in my mailbox that I put in a drawer unopened. I wasn't ready to hear from her. Didn't know if I ever would be. About a month after the wedding, Harold called with news. Brandon was being sued by multiple creditors. His financial situation had completely collapsed. More interestingly, Amanda had filed for divorce. The marriage that had barely begun was already over. She'd moved out of their apartment, gone back to living on her own. I felt nothing when Harold told me that. No satisfaction, no vindication, just emptiness. My daughter's life had fallen apart, and I couldn't bring myself to care. Maybe that made me a bad father. Or maybe it just made me human. As the weeks turned into months, I started to heal. Not completely, but enough to function. I found a rhythm again, got back into the routines that had sustained me for years. Up at dawn, work through the day, evening on the porch, watching the sunset. It was lonely, but I'd been lonely before. I knew how to survive it. I started reaching out to people I'd neglected over the years. Old friends, neighbors, the community I'd been part of, but never fully engaged with. I went to the weekly farmers market in town, sold apples and vegetables, stayed to chat afterward, accepted invitations to dinner, to church socials, to community events I'd usually skipped. Harold became a regular visitor, stopping by every few weeks for coffee and conversation. We'd sit on the porch and talk about nothing important. Sports weather town gossip. Never about Amanda, unless I brought her up, which I rarely did. His friendship meant more to me than I could express. One Saturday, Harold brought his grandson to see the farm. 8-year-old kid named Tommy, full of energy and questions. Reminded me of Amanda at that age, always curious, always underfoot. Tommy wanted to see everything pet, every animal, know how everything worked. I spent the afternoon showing him around, answering his endless questions. It felt good to share the farm with someone who appreciated it purely without hidden agendas. After they left, I sat on the porch and thought about legacy. I'd spent so long thinking the farm would go to Amanda, that she'd care for it after I was gone. Now I didn't know what would happen to it. Legally, she was still the beneficiary of the trust. When I died, it would go to her. She'd probably sell it immediately, take the money, and never look back. The thought made me sad, but I accepted it. That was her choice to make. Or maybe I'd change the trust, leave the farm to a conservation group, or divide it up among several beneficiaries, or establish some kind of agricultural scholarship. I had time to decide. For now, it was enough that the farm was safe, and I was still here to work it. 3 months after the wedding, I received another letter from Amanda. This one I opened. It was shorthand written. She said she was sorry, that she'd made terrible mistakes, been blinded by Brandon's promises, convinced herself that taking the farm was somehow fair or justified. She said she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again, that she deserved my anger. But she hoped someday I might forgive her. I read the letter 3 times, then put it back in the envelope. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready for forgiveness yet. Maybe someday I would be, or maybe I wouldn't. Either way was okay. What I had learned through all of this was that you can't make people be who you need them to be. Amanda was who she was, had made her choices, would live with the consequences. I couldn't fix her, or save her, or make her see things differently. All I could do was protect myself and move forward. I also learned that being alone isn't the same as being lonely. I'd spent 20 years defining myself as Amanda's father, seeing my purpose through that relationship. Now, I had to find purpose in other things. In the work I did, the land I tended, the community. I belonged to the friendships I'd neglected. It was harder than I expected, but also freeing in a way I hadn't anticipated. One evening, I was sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. The air was cool autumn coming on. The farm was quiet except for the usual sounds, crickets and cattle, and wind through the trees. I thought about Sarah, wondered what she'd make of everything that had happened. I'd kept my promise to her. I'd kept the farm safe for Amanda, just like I said I would. That Amanda had tried to take it before her time didn't change the fact that it would still be hers someday. I'd done what I promised. I'd raised our daughter the best I could. If she'd made bad choices, that was on her, not me. I thought about my own father, about the legacy he'd left me. It wasn't just the land, though, that mattered. It was the values, the work ethic, the understanding that some things are worth protecting. That dignity matters. That you don't compromise your principles just because it's easier. He'd taught me that, and I'd tried to teach Amanda. Whether the lesson took or not, I'd done my part. I didn't hate Brandon. Hating him would give him too much power. He was a desperate man who'd made desperate choices, and now he was paying for them. I didn't hate Amanda either, though I was hurt by her in ways that might never fully heal. She was still my daughter. I still loved her, even if I didn't trust her, even if I didn't want her in my life right now. Love isn't simple. It doesn't turn off just because someone betrays you. What I felt was sad. Sad that things had turned out this way. Sad that my daughter's wedding had ended in disaster. Sad that a relationship I'd treasured was maybe broken beyond repair. But sadness passes. Time doesn't heal all wounds, but it does make them easier to carry. I sat on that porch as the sun disappeared below the hills and thought about the future. I was 57 years old. Maybe I had 20 good years left, maybe 30 if I was lucky. What did I want to do with that time? Keep working the farm, obviously, but what else? Who else did I want to be besides a farmer and a father? I didn't have answers yet. But for the first time in months, I felt like I had space to ask the questions. The crisis was over. The farm was protected. I was safe. Everything else I could figure out as I went. The stars came out one by one. I stayed on the porch until it was full dark, then went inside. Tomorrow, I'd get up early and start again. There were apples to harvest, fences to check, 1,000 small tasks that made up a day on the farm. It was simple work, honest work. Work that I understood. That was enough. Sometimes losing someone you love is the price of keeping yourself whole. I don't know if Amanda and I will ever find our way back to each other. Maybe we will. Maybe we won't. Part of me hopes we do. Part of me has accepted that we might not. But I do know this. I'd rather be alone with my dignity than surrounded by people who see me as nothing more than a means to an end. And maybe that's the hardest lesson a father ever has to learn. The farm is still here, still mine, still safe. 300 acres of Tennessee land that my grandfather bought, my father worked, and I've protected. Someday it'll pass to someone else. Maybe Amanda, maybe not. But while I'm alive, it's mine, and nobody takes from me what I'm not willing to give. I think about that wedding sometimes, about standing in front of 200 people and being asked to hand over everything I'd worked for, about the slap that echoed through that ballroom, about walking out with my head high even though my heart was breaking. I think about those moments, and I don't regret how I handled it. Could I have done things differently, huh? Could I have been quieter, less dramatic, more forgiving? Probably. But sometimes you have to make noise. Sometimes you have to stand your ground publicly, so there's no question where you stand. I protected what was mine. I stood up for myself. I refused to be manipulated, or bullied, or shamed into giving up what I'd spent a lifetime building. And yes, it cost me my daughter, at least for now. But if I'd given in, if I'd handed over those keys, I'd have lost myself instead. And that price was too high. So here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever had to make a choice like that? Had to stand your ground, even when it cost you something precious? Had to protect yourself, even when it meant losing someone you loved. Drop a comment and tell me your story. And if this story meant something to you, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel, because I've got more stories to tell about life, family, and the hard choices we all have to make sometimes. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's struggling with where to draw their own lines. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't easy to tell, and I'm sure it wasn't always easy to hear. But I believe in honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. I hope you found something valuable in it, something that helps you with your own struggles and decisions. Take care of yourselves out there. Protect what matters. And remember that sometimes the loneliest path is also the right one.